Very lucky to have among us today writer and public speaker Li Jia. I really hope I'm not mispronouncing anyone's name.
Yes, you did. Yes, you said it right. Yeah,
thank you. So Li Jia is an engaged writer, journalist, and social commentator featured in The Guardian, the BBC, and the New York Times. But she's also author to acclaimed memoir Socialism is Great, and of novel Lotus, which follows the story of a prostitute in China. So thank you so much for making time for this. I believe I could dive right into my first question, if that's okay for you.
Yes. Okay, yeah.
So my first question is, I know that you like to think of yourself as a sort of communicator between China and the world.
Mm-hmm.
So as a communicator yourself, in an era in which we see more and more forms of communication evolving and expanding the roles, what would you say could represent the most valid medium filling the knowledge gaps that exist between China and the Western world?
I would say all kinds of media and news, books, both fiction, non-fiction, and films. Reading news is very important, of course, but not enough, partly because the China-related news in the West often tend to be negative, or news that will show China in bad light. And besides, news do not always tell you how the Chinese people live their lives. When I go to a new country, I usually try to read books about this country and watch films, and I find that's a good way to get to know a country.
Thank you. Yeah, I believe you're right. And I think Broken Wings actually gives us a very good example of this. So, yeah. My second question is, how much would you say it is possible? I believe you've already half answered to this within your first question, but how much would you say it is possible to rely on literature to make the Western world better aware of the issues that are still affecting certain areas of China? And if so, to what extent do you think a translation of Pingwa's work can effectively serve the purpose of educating Western readers?
And I think literature is a very important window to observe and understand the country, its culture, value, and daily life. Unfortunately, people tend to read writers from their own country. In the UK, for example, only 1.5% of all books are translations. It's just a tiny percent. Let me tell you a story about this English writer, Anne Morgan. She had this realization when she looked at her bookshelf, and she suddenly realized that most of her books there were written by British or North American authors. So she called herself a literary xenophobia. So then she decided to spend 2012, that's the year London hosted the Olympics. She spent 2012 reading one book from every country in the world. So that became a book, Reading the World, Confession of a Literary Explorer. And in this book, she also claimed that, talk about her experience, and she claimed that her experience had changed the way she viewed the world. So, but the trend, but I'm just trying to say people, the translation still occupies a small percentage of the market. But I think the trend is changing, and more people are willing to read literature from other countries. On Wednesday, I gave a talk to a big book group and at a Blackheath Library about my novel Lotus. And we were talking about this, and they told me this, a group of women, 12 women, they told me that they were more interested in reading books written by the Chinese, talking about their own experience, whereas before they were more likely read books written by the British people talking about their experience, and they felt their hand being held, feel safe that way. But that is changing. I think that's a good sign.
So I was wondering, since the book is mainly focused on the issues of women trafficking and then underdevelopment of rural areas throughout the whole story, as a Chinese journalist, writer, and of course a reader yourself living in the UK, are there any current themes that you feel like is relevant to have more of in literature today? And how can translation further support communication between our societies, so the Eastern and the Western?
Right. So yes, so I would like to follow up your question. I believe I'm one of the first journalists who managed to interview the victims of human trafficking. The wife is being trafficked. And I have written at least half a dozen stories on the issue. And I actually even took part in rescue mission, rescue women, those being trafficked, and they're often being locked up. So each trafficked woman suffered untold misery, being raped, beaten, humiliated, and the freedom restricted and sometimes chained. Like recently, I'm sure many of you have heard the story, but this young woman was discovered in Xuzhou in Eastern China, and it was winter, she wear thin clothes and she was chained, and meanwhile she was kept as wife, and she had 8 children with an old farmer. Horrific story. And just like a butterfly, this character from Broken Wings, and those trafficked women face the dilemma of leaving the village themselves or leaving behind their children. All rural population believe that the children belong to the man's family. So every year, thousands of Chinese women, usually from poor regions such as Yunnan, Sichuan, Guizhou, they are kidnapped and sold to farmers in other poor regions as wife. Why, you may ask? Because it is cheaper to buy a wife than to marry one properly, because you have to, the wedding banquets. And secondly, there are not, even you have money, there are not enough women in the village, because as a result of China's strict family planning policy. And the rural China tends to be conservative and even backward, who don't care enough about women's rights. And the Chinese government has launched numerous campaigns against human trafficking and passed several laws against human traffickers and buyers, but the problem still thrives in rural China. And I think these people outside China probably don't know this is going on in China. And books like Broken Wing really can educate and enlighten people.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Daniel maybe posted a link if anyone wants to know more about the
both the Xuzhou case and as well as the recent article that Li Jia wrote for the SCMP. I think both of them will be good reading for the kind of on the ground context of the events that we talk about in this book. I think Nicky has a quick question for Li Jia before she leaves. Do you mind, Li Jia?
Yeah, not at all, please, Nicky.
Yeah, okay. I know we're going to come back to this with my discussion with Maria, but Li Jia, you're in such a good position to tell us what you feel about all the controversy that Jia Pingwa faced when he wrote this book. A lot of women in China were extremely angry with him for the way he presented the farmers and the way he presented the woman, and the fact that they thought that the women criticized him for not sorry, the women criticized him for not condemning kidnapping strongly enough. So I'd really like to know your view on that.
Oh, that's a interesting question. First of all, I think a writer, when they think about if they will cause controversy, they probably won't be able to produce great works. They should write what they feel. And also, I don't think, I think it's not, I think it's very important writer should present the truth. And it's not exactly a writer's job to condemn the phenomenon.
Thank you so much. That was all very inspiring and hopefully gave a lot to our readers to understand more about this great work. I believe you might have to leave us now. So
not yet. I will.
Oh, fantastic.
That's good. So if more questions come in for you, we will just ask our participants to kindly post them in the chat. Maybe if nobody has a question ready like right now, I would say again a big thank you for joining us, and I would turn to our second guest for today, if that's okay. It is a real pleasure for me to be able to speak to someone who really has been who's been working very closely with this book, and that is our translator Nicky Harman. Hi, hello, Nicky.
Hello, hi, delighted to be here.
I believe you were not new to the work of Jia Pingwa, as you also previously translated Happy Dreams, if I'm not wrong.
That's right, yes. I've translated several of his books, but this was the second. Yep, so this one was the second, Happy Dreams was the first.
That's good. When not translating, Nicky also promotes contemporary Chinese fiction through the website Paper Republic, if you would like to note it down and have a look later if you're interested. And she's also involved in talks in mentoring new translators. She teaches summer school and is a judge in translation competitions. I hope that is all right. So with such a busy schedule, thank you, Nicky, for making time for us today. I would like to start with my first question, if that's okay for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is quite something that comes from my personal perspective. I feel like I have really learned a lot from reading this book, and I mean both about village life customs in rural China and the social issues that these same areas are still affected by at present times. So as a translator, I was going to ask if you felt that you were some way contributing to the education of an English-speaking audience. And if you allow me, I like the idea of acting as a bridge between cultures. I don't know if you ever experienced the feeling while working on this book.
Well, yes, with every book I translate, I often say that I feel like I'm opening a window, and it's a great privilege to be able to open that window towards China for English language readers. But that said, I think there's an issue here. I think that novels must work as novels. Novels are not reportage. They're completely different. Fiction is not the same as non-fiction. It's quite hard to, I mean, we could discuss for ages exactly how the approach of a novel is different from the approach of a newspaper article. But I do believe they are. A little story, I have a good friend who'd never read a book translated from Chinese, and I gave her a book about a woman, by a woman, another author, completely different, a different publisher. And I said, I'd love to know what you think of it. And she came back to me and she said she'd read it in her reading group. And she had no idea that the life of Chinese women was like that. And I went, oh dear, that's not kind of really the answer I wanted. I wanted to know from her whether it worked as a novel. Was she moved by it? Did she feel the language was expressive? So as a translator, you're always treading a fine line. You have to translate. and that's your duty to translate what the writer wrote. At the same time, you are in a position of being a bridge or the opener of a window. So you're kind of in this position of doing two things. You're loyal to the author. You also have a duty to make it readable for the reader. And you have to do that without distorting what the author wrote. So yes, I do think that, I hope that readers will understand more about China reading this novel, but I don't want them to go away thinking that all of China is full of villages where women get kidnapped and imprisoned, because China is a multi-layered place full of so many people, so many different ways of life. And I also want the readers of this novel to understand that this is the way that people feel in China, not just the way they live, but the way they feel. This book is about feelings, and it's about landscape, and it's about literature. So it's about many different things. I haven't really answered your question. I think I've diverged a bit.
No, I believe you did. And to be honest, as a translator myself, I see a lot the importance coming, like, I do tend to see a lot of responsibility on the part of the readers themselves. It's not just up to the translator or the author himself to convey what they're trying to convey. Then it's also like they do the first part, but then what is actually perceived in the end, I believe, is a lot on the readers, like how much background research they do, if they're actually interested in the topic that it's being handled, how much they already know perhaps about the topic. So I do believe it's up to the translator, but then it's also up to the readers to fully understand what it is to be understood from that novel.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's a natural reaction when you're reading a novel about a society that you don't know about, to see that as a portrayal of that society. And when I need to remind myself of that, I think of novels I've read about, let's say, translated from Arabic, about societies that I know very little about. And of course, I see that novel as a portrayal of that society. But I also try to look at it as a novel and think, do I like this as a work of literature? And I think all readers do that.
Yeah, I believe you're right. Yeah. So I think this now leads me to my second question. And this is something you already addressed by asking your question to Licia, but I will ask it anyways, because I want to hear your opinion. So we already discussed about how the author, what the author does with the characters of Broken Wings has been defined by critics as, not all of them, but some critics defined it as rather controversial, or even some of them have defined it as an endorsement of human trafficking and a defense of a backwards way of life. So although this is already made clear by the author in his afterword, this was not his real intent. There are sections in the book in which it is clear how he can sympathize with both Butterfly, but also the rural men for whom it is basically impossible to find women to marry. So my question was, as a translator, but also as a woman, what were your feelings towards this apparent controversy?
Well, I was aware of the delicacy of the topic, if you like. I was aware how sensitive it was when I was translating the book. I wasn't really aware of the controversy until after I'd finished the translation. I'm not sure I would have been influenced. I'm not sure I would have been influenced by the controversy, but I think it's entirely understandable. Women in China are angry. Men in China are angry that this is happening. And of course, outside China. How did I feel when I was translating it? I was impressed, but also, was I annoyed? I don't think I was really annoyed with Jia Pingwa. I was actually impressed by how even-handed he was. And I think that this is quite a difficult trick to carry off, because as a writer and as a human being, pressure is on him to take sides. And in a way, he does something which I probably couldn't do myself, which is not to take sides in a dramatic black and white way. And this is in itself an achievement. You know, it may really annoy people. It may make the readers feel that it's morally not really tenable, that he should have taken sides. But I actually found that because he created this character Butterfly, and the way he described her and the way he kind of gets inside her as a character, I found it rather beautiful. I also found the brutality of village life truly shocking. And it wasn't so much the brutality of Bright Black, the man whose father actually buys Butterfly, or even the rape scene is pretty horrific. It's not so much that, because the couple do eventually have a kind of relationship. This made me think, is this possible? I wondered, I actually went and looked up, what's it called? Stockholm Syndrome, where the victim comes to sympathize with the perpetrator of the crime. And I just wondered, can this really happen? Can it be that a woman who's been violently raped can establish a relationship with her, with the perpetrator? And so that really made me think. It made me think. I also felt, as I said, shocked by that particular rape scene. But the truly shocking thing I felt was the brutality of the other people in the village. Butterfly was not the only woman who was trafficked in that village. There were others as well. And some of them, quote unquote, had their legs broken when they tried to run away. So there was that kind of casual brutality, which is only mentioned as just as a kind of offhand comment. And that was really shocking. There's something else which, in a way, prevented me from making a snap judgment. And that is the fact that the ending, there are kind of two possible endings to the novel, and you're never quite sure which one is the dream and which one happens, or maybe they're both dreams. Does Butterfly escape? Does she not escape? If she escapes, does she go back because she doesn't want to leave her baby? She doesn't want to abandon her baby. So there are all sorts of layers of ambivalence. And Jia Pingwa creates a novel which is kind of grey rather than black and white. So it left me a lot to think about.
I believe it left you a lot to think about, and maybe I wouldn't dare too much, but maybe a lot of freedom in finding the right voice when writing the English version. I believe this actually takes me to my last question. So yeah, maybe just to give you a little bit of context in what I was thinking. I was actually really curious to know, considering there's apparent controversy that we just discussed, how hard it was for you to find or tune in the right voice. So were there any moments where you hesitated because you felt like in your writing you could have sympathized with either of the characters, or was the overall process rather straightforward for you?
I think in the case of this novel, it was relatively straightforward for me. In other words, I could think myself into the mind of Butterfly, and I could see the men of the village and the other women in the village. I could see them in my mind's eye. Another thing that was good for me was that I was allowed to write in British English. And when I translated Happy Dreams, I had to make it acceptable to American English readers. And that was just so difficult for me because it was a novel full of bad language. And I don't know American bad language. I don't write American slang. I don't speak American slang. But with Butterfly, with this novel, I felt it was easier for me to write natural language. It came more easily to me. And what I was quite impressed by was the way Jia Pingwa describes himself, his difficulty in creating a voice for Butterfly, because, as he says, she's young, she's rather uneducated, unsophisticated. He's a man, much older. And so he felt he had the difficulty in creating her voice. With Happy Dreams, I felt it was incredibly difficult, not just because I had to make something appropriate for Americans, but also because this was like a bunch of men who were really rough and talking dialect and swearing a city language. It was really difficult.
I believe it would be interesting to have a deeper discussion about Happy Dreams. As a translator, I would have several questions to ask you, but we will probably keep this for another time.
Another time. One book is enough.
Yeah. And then I would have to read Happy Dreams myself first. So I will maybe take some time, and then we'll come back another time. Thank you so much.
Right before we go off into the breakout rooms, Maria, do you mind if I just add or ask Nicky another quick question? Nicky, it's you obviously, to give everyone a bit of context here, Nicky is also working with us on another book called The Soldier and Tea Shop, and these two books both this and Tea Shop is unique in the sense that they're both written from the perspective of women, but obviously Jia Pingwa is a very, very, very much male writer, like in his late, I believe, 60s now, Ying? 60s or something?
Yes, he must be 69, 70, maybe 70 next year.
Indeed. So I'm just wondering if there's any particularities you've noticed in his writing about how he depicts these female writers that you would point out that would be of note, basically.
The way he portrays his women characters.
Female characters, yes.
Female characters. No, I think that's the sign of a very good writer, that every book has a different tone. You know, I can't say that Butterfly in any way resembles the very sophisticated city women of the Soldier and Tea Shop. And I think that's the sign of a great writer. It's also the sign of a good translator that you don't keep reproducing your tone. He doesn't plagiarize himself. On the contrary, he produces a different book every time. So in the Soldier and Tea Shop, you get urban women. In a way, that was almost more difficult to translate because they had so much culture, and I had to convey their high culture, the culture of the tea drinking, the culture of art, of Buddhism. And I had a woman I was working with on the translation, Liu Jun, who kept bringing me up short by saying, do you realize what he's trying to say behind that? And I'm going, oh, okay, thank you. Right, now we've got to get that into the translation. There's a lot less high culture in this book that we're talking about. High culture is extraordinarily difficult to convey in translation.
Thank you very much for that. So sorry, back to you, Maria. Sorry for jumping in.
No, thank you for your question. And I'm sure your answers, Nicky, will have given a lot to our readers to think about, which is why I think this will be a great time for us to gather in our breakout rooms. We will have about 15 minutes. And then when you finish, if you finish the discussion, the discussion early, sorry, you're welcome to come back and join us in the main room. So just to give you a little inspiration to spark your discussion, I will post in the chat a few questions that you may want to think about while you are in the breakout rooms, or you might just come up with your own questions yourselves. This is just a little suggestion. Is it all right, Daniel, for me to post them in the chat here? Or
yeah, I'll open the room. Why don't you post them, and then we'll open the rooms, and then we'll go. We'll also shoot them to the rooms as well.
Okay, thanks. I will send them in a second. And
so there's going to be 4 rooms overall of 3 rooms of 5 to 1 rooms of 4. And don't worry if you don't get these questions now. I'll also shoot them out to the older rooms as well. So I'm just going to start it now. 3, 2, 1. Open them back, everyone.
Yeah.
And yes, indeed. Apologies. I seem to have mistimed it slightly. I think I brought everyone back about 5 minutes too early. But I hope you had a wonderful discussion. That was my bad entirely. But yeah, I'll let you take it from here, Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I hope you'll have a lovely chat and a good chance to compare ideas and opinions. I believe we all had some pretty good insights from our guests. So I'm now going to ask the great question of who would like to break the ice and bring their own contribution to the conversation. Of course, you can feel free to both jump in and share what's been discussed in your breakout room, but also any feedback and suggestions for the Readers Club are welcome. You can let us know if you enjoyed the book or if you didn't, and if you did not, why you did not enjoy it. So any contribution is more than welcome. You can both use the chat or open your camera and microphone and make your voices heard. I promise no one's faces will be shown ever again. Some people are scared about this, so I'm just gonna remind everyone that no faces will be shown.
Who would like to go first? I think that's the key question. James, perhaps? Did you have an interesting discussion?
It was just like discussing like how almost I'm just like until sort of I started reading most of or some of the books here that I was quite unaware of sort of a lot of Chinese culture and sort of or modern culture, and how I wasn't like I always find it sort of hard to figure out the time period in which certain or these books are written, because I think sometimes I'm just like, oh, it must have been set of quite a few decades ago when it was more recent, and I always find that quite surprising.
What did you discuss in your group, if you don't mind me asking?
Or it's just sort of like how it's a very sort of like impactful start to the novel, and so I'm not very good at talking publicly in front of people.
No worries, no worries. How about you, Max?
Actually, just to jump on the point that James made about sort of having read lots of Chinese literature in the last few months, it's very that point about sometimes not almost being immediately being able to recognize the context of like when a novel is set, because of sort of how because of the societal differences between the UK and China. I think in that sense it's very interesting and can be very informative. But to bring it back more to discussion on Broken Wings, so in our group we were discussing how despite the fact that there's some really sort of troubling and dark subject matter related to human trafficking, it's interesting that there is this through the voice of Butterfly, there's this sort of underlying message of sort of hope and perseverance, because of the way she sort of tries to respond to this adversity, which was something that we found quite interesting. So yeah, that was probably for those of us that had read it in our group, that was what stood out to us the most. And yeah, just going back to the sort of second question about how this book can kind of inform readers more in terms of being aware of certain societal issues. Again, I think in translated literature more broadly, I think that's something that's really, really powerful. And sometimes you might read, you know, it's interesting because you might read a novel not necessarily expecting to be informed, and maybe thinking you might be more that you might read it more for entertainment purposes. But it's really really interesting how the translated literature gives us this way of learning more about different societies, in this case China, but you can obviously apply that to any form of translated literature. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. It's part of why, like, I think if nothing else, the recent like kind of Booker International win has demonstrated it's a window into another world, right? For example, there's this, I remember this being this really big complaint this morning about how The Independent said that The Tomb of Sand was an Indian novel written in Indian rather than Hindi. And I mean, it's just that, like, to have those conversations on a national scale, I think it's incredibly worthwhile. And yes, so anyone else have any feedback? I don't suppose I can call on anyone, could I? Michael, perhaps?
Yeah, we were sort of mid-conversation there. And as James has already touched on, I mean, the question that I raised was a difference in the impressions from a Chinese readership and a foreign readership in translation into English. So I just briefly what I question is, the Chinese readership would know a broader context of the setting of the remote rural area and its backwardness and these lingering feudal customs within a society, an urbanizing society, modernizing society, and so on. See it in context to some extent. They may be shocked by what's going on, you know, in those remote areas, which Chinese, especially young people, wouldn't have experienced themselves. But translated into English, you have a readership which would be largely unaware of or ignorant of the context of this and the particular focus in Pingwa's story here. So literature and translation really is a very challenging task, in the sense that you have a pretty blank, I mean, readership. Of course, I said amongst us, we know more about Chinese society and know more about Chinese literature and stories and so on. But what the question to this would really be, do you know, particularly Nicky, of the Chinese take on Jia Pingwa's novel, this particular one, or in general of his stories? Is there any way to tell what Chinese readers have? You said there was a certain anger. So generally.
The trouble is, I don't know what the appreciative readers felt. I only know what the angry readers felt. But there must have been some readers who really thought that he'd written quite a beautiful novel, even though it was, it asks quite profound moral questions and doesn't really answer them. So I don't know. I mean, maybe Ying could tell us more about how the literary critics did they talk about the novel from the point of view of the reader? I wish I could tell you more about how Chinese readers who were not angry with it actually felt about it. But I can't. Maybe someone else here could.
I have one anecdote that I could possibly share, and it's this is me conjecturing based on the data I've seen, but my guess is that where this really comes down is a rural-urban thing. So if you're from the background that this book talks about, you get the necessity of it. Like you understand the fact that what Jia Pingwa is trying to do is present an argument with at least in real life, no clear solution. And then from the urban aspect of it is that some of these people have been so far removed from the rural roots that like maybe their ancestors have lived in, that they don't really have a grounding in what that background is anymore. And the reason why at least I'm led to suspect this is because of the marketing reception we've had in English when we were marketing this book. And we really found that if you're from a prosperous kind of Northern Hemisphere society, like most of Europe or North America, your response to this book is more negative than someone from like the global South, basically, where it may not necessarily be like they agree with all of the viewpoints that presented in this book, but they understand where this book is coming from and they understand the urgency of this title. And it has been our experience that generally speaking, like if you're getting feedback from a Northern Hemisphere location, their main target is, for example, like the old, like similar to the Chinese argument, it's straight male cancer, they call it. And they call it, and how dare a straight Han guy write about women in this way, sort of thing. But then once you get to the global South, especially when you get to places like India or Africa, the global reception has been like, this is what happens. This is as close to reality as you're going to get in a written form. And I personally found that really interesting. And Ying, I'm not sure if that is applicable to a Chinese context. What do you think?
Well, there is some, because I have been living here for so long now, and I have a little bit sort of like didn't have much dialogue or no, I mean, when I read this novel, I was completely shocked, you know, as everybody else, you know, in this country, I think. Because from the history's point of view, and women traffic is always very heavy punishment since Song dynasty. That is about 500-700 years ago. And, you know, in those days, if you are selling or buying women or children, you will get basically a very severe punishment. You know, they are putting you not only in jail, and some cases you can be hanged or you can be drowned, you know, in a very different area. And so really, I thought, growing up in Beijing, and obviously this kind of thing, because newspaper and the reason we all know, you do not, in those days, when I was young, you do not have WeChat, you do not have social media. So basically, we do not know this kind of thing existing even. And so now by reading, you know, we're publishing this, but we're reading, especially recently, you know, the journalist recovered, there are several other cases in China. I mean, I was completely shocked. I mean, it sounds pathetic, but really that is how it happened, you know, to me. And I just feel, I mean, you know, people recently criticize what Jia Pingwa's argument in a way in this book is he showed sympathy, you know, in kind of sympathy to the villagers, you know, who left behind. And actually, although I do not agree with him, because I think doesn't matter, you know, what situation you are living in, you still shouldn't against human will to force people.
Ying, I'm just gonna interrupt you 1 second. I'd just like to thank Nicky has to run off to a goodbye party, I guess. Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us, Nicky, and thank you for all the really valuable answers you've provided.
Thank you, Nicky. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Nicky. Thank you. Sorry, maybe I was carried out a little bit too long, but all I'm saying is, in a way, I could see what Jia tried to say here. Basically, if a village, all women has left, there's only a whole village with men, and there should be something to be dealt with. That's all.
It's like that afterward, right? And I think Nicky rendered it really well.
That's right.
I think the point that really got me was that how he mentioned, like, these are the last villages of China. After this point, this way of life dies out. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to your interpretation, but these are the facts on the ground. And that's ultimately sad to me. So sorry, I'm not sure if that answered your question, Michael. Anyone else have any feedback? Anna, maybe? Perhaps? Hey.
Sure. Yeah, like I guess like something that I was thinking about, or like we were discussing a little bit, was that like the afterword really does give like context for like the issues in the book, and like once you know more about like why Jia Pingwa wrote the novel, it all makes more sense. It's like even though like so at first when I like was first reading it, I was a bit like, why is like a man writing about like sexual violence in this way? Like why does he feel the need to do it? But after reading the afterword, I was like, well, actually it makes sense that this isn't like just an isolated incident. It's like a wider phenomenon that like isn't like just about gender politics. It's about like all sorts of different factors. So yeah, I kind of can understand like why it was written more, and I do appreciate that it was like Jia Pingwa taking the time to kind of like speak about these issues, even though that they're hard to talk about, and that like I appreciate the idea that it's like, even though people like Bright obviously do terrible things, but like to actually solve these problems, you kind of do have to see where they're coming from and like why they would do such things, because like you would need to address those causes, like the economic disparity between urban and rural areas, to do anything about it. So you need to know like where they're coming from and like to understand like actually why it's happening. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. So that's like things that I appreciated about the novel.
I think one of the factors is that like I think in China, especially in writing environment like China, where it's like in the hands of a lesser writer, this he wouldn't have covered it with this much, I guess, finesse, the only word I can think of. And it's hard to talk about, and it's hard. He took a hard task and he wrote about it in the hardest way he possibly could have wrote about it. So it's in that sense, like I have a lot of respect for him. So does anyone else have any feedback, I guess? Debbie, perhaps?
Yes. Hi.
Yay.
Yeah, I wanted to feedback from our group because some really good stuff was said, I felt. I know Kelly in our group, she shared about the thing about the rural and urban sort of divide, and how well that was shown in the book, and how the villages had suffered so much, in like depletion of people and etc. But I mean, one thing that really came across in our group was that people felt that the plight of women was really highlighted in the book. How so very many women in the world, have no choices. They have to do what other people say. They are manipulated in such a way as to really remove their freedom, and give them no freedom at all, and how that was Lucy in particular, said how much she disliked the book. You know, she hated the book in the sense that it made her extremely angry from that point of view, that that this is the way so many women are treated, that they're just kind of, they could be trafficked in this way and treated so abusively, you know. So I think that really came across strongly in our group as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much. Anyone else, I suppose?
Yeah, in our group discussion, I was just starting to reminisce a bit about the early Chinese literature of the May 4th period, which we've been actually discussing.
I think Lucy is really hooking onto that. Sorry, I'm just looking at Lucy's webcam as well. I think Lucy's hooking onto your point. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. So the story we started with in translation with this group of about 10 of us, The Diary of a Madman by Lu Xun. And there we have, of course, a kind of caricature of the society as he saw it. China with people who were completely callous and had been really almost destroyed, ordinary people. And this was within the family. I'm sure many of you, most of you, all of you are familiar with the story. But the actually alarming thing is that sort of over 100 years later, here we have in a fiction form, but a reflection more realistically, I think, than Lu Xun. Lu Xun's was really just a caricature of a man-eating society where people were prepared to sacrifice one another and even their family members for their own gratification, as a man. And now we have, over 100 years, we have Malays as part of the society, is real brute reality. It makes you think, and whether actually revelations of this kind of sickness in society have any effect in translating, writing fiction and translating fiction, in actually changing the status quo, changing the situation in any way. These are just reflections.
It's I think it's tricky, isn't it? I think Angus just mentioned that he can call on you, Angus. I think, do you have any particular feedback about this book?
Yeah, I was in a room just with one other individual, I think, Lulu, I believe, and we were talking about a few different things, but the urban-rural divide, or at least the fact this is rural China or rural Shanxi, came up because I confess to Lulu, I've not actually read this book. I've been too intimidated by the subject matter, even though it's on my shelf. And she said, yeah, there are bits that I found funny. And I said, oh, funny? Funny how? It's such a serious book. And she said, it's the stupid things that some of the rural characters do. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I know Jia's works. In Jia's works, he's really, you can tell that he cares about the underprivileged rural people of Shanxi. And she said, no, it's in like a tasteful way. It doesn't come off as mean. And that got me thinking of the Jia Pingwa book I have read, Happy Dreams, another one translated by Nicky. And in that we have characters who've gone from the countryside to the city to do poorly paid jobs, which are still better than anything they can get home, that's a huge thing in China. That's a thing where the urban-rural divide plays out. So that we were tangentially led onto that. That tangentially led me to mention another Jia book that you guys have published, The Mountain Whisperer, which is also in the mountains of Shanxi. And tangentially, we were wondering if the urban-rural divide is kind of played out in Jia's career, because if I understand correctly, his early books, including one you can get in English called, I always jumble up how the title is translated, Ruined City?
Ruined Capital.
I think it's City.
Oh, is it?
I'm pretty sure.
My bad.
Anyway, that's set in, it's an urban novel that's set in the capital of Shanxi province, Xi'an. And then his later works, as I understand it, were out in the countryside. And then our conversation finally ended talking about the dishes of Shanxi. And apparently, Lulu told me there's some very interesting sounding local delicacies in this book that she'd like to try making. And that's where our conversation took us. Of course, any good conversation about China, you should be talking about the local delicacies. So mission accomplished.
I had a discussion with we have the marketing team recently, and we're wondering if this is something people like to see using social media and stuff. Would people like to see the recipes of the books as displayed as talked about? So for example, in this one, I think one of the books that one of the food items that keeps coming up is this kind of porridge gruel type deal that they boil together with buckwheat and whatnot. Would people like to see that being made in a kind of social media context? And maybe like,
yes.
Okay, well, all those in favor of seeing that, raise your hands, I would say. Excellent. Oh well, we'll look into that, and then we'll disperse those video links shortly. Then I guess. Any more feedback, Kelly, Lucy, perhaps, Jai? Yeah.
May I contribute to this discussion as a Chinese? Well, I can only speak for myself. I can't like represent all Chinese readers, but to me, what I like the most about this book is the translation of those cultural references, like about the food, local delicacy, and customs. Because I'm also doing translation as Maria, and I really like the way Nicky translate also the character's name and also those cultural references. And I actually have a question for her, but I didn't have a chance to ask. It's about the translation of the title, because the original is Jihua, just non-such flower, but she translated into Broken Wings. Probably I will email her later about that. And as for what we have talked about, like the rural and urban divide, and how, well, I actually quite respect the fact that Jia Pingwa, he's able to emphasize with people living in this, living amidst this vanishment of rural life due to the urban and rural disparity. But I also understand it's very reasonable for readers to criticize against some just how he portrays those characters, those perpetrators, in a kind of. I read some reviews and comments. They say like he kind of romanticizes and rationalized this kind of human trafficking activity, and I think for me as Daniel just talked about that human trafficking incident in Xuzhou, I think I'm able to put that into the context and contextualize this book better. I still think this is a catch-22, and is Jia Pingwa, he posed this really this question really difficult to answer, and as a writer, he is able to shed light on this social issue, but maybe it's for the readers and others to explore how to solve this issue, and that's also I think it's a crux of the matter. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Kelly. Like, if you want to pass that question on to Nicky, and you can't find her, can't quite find her email me, and then I'll forward the question on to her. Okay. Cool. Any more feedback, anyone? Or Jai Yang. I think you have to unmute yourself. We can't quite hear you.
All right. Are you able to hear?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I don't know if I'm qualified to make any discussion conversation because I haven't read the book yet. But I've been living in the U.S. for more than 15 years, and I teach modern Chinese literature in the colleges. So I've been really interested in all the novels, the fictions that write about the female characters. So that's why when I just come across this event online and then just register quickly and come into the room. So, but my focus is, when Mr. Sheringham just mentioned the Lu Xun like century ago when he started to writing literature, quit his medical career and started his writing career. And he wished, that's most of the main fourth generation writers wish that they could use literature to enlighten, to emancipate this masked Chinese people, let them realize how tragic life they're in. They can rescue, they can save themselves. However, the whole century passed. If you read the main fourth generation writers, short fiction, short stories, and then you can notice when they write about female characters, they were so sympathized with these women. They were the victims. They realized it's almost like the female are the metaphor for the national salvation. It's like if you save the women and you save the country. And always in China, the female character, the women are the utmost, I would say, utmost of victims. They are the lowest. If the men were bullied, then the men went back home to beat their wives. The arranged marriages or, all sorts of women are always the victims. And then this book, Jia Pingwa, I really respect his career and his courage. His obviously, I read some summary and some comments online. It seems like the women's life gets even worse after a whole century. That's somewhere I'm really like, I don't know if I'm still qualified as a Chinese reader since I've been living in US for so long. But I'm always keep my eye updated with the current affairs in China, particularly the recent that made to the headline of so many newspapers, the chained woman in Xuzhou, and people were so angry, and they didn't know what's going on. And then when they find out, some of the villages, there are so many coverage on the later on, more stories, more cases were discovered. And some village, there are like 60% of the wives were from, they bought from somewhere. They're not free will, like all these women, and they're staying there. So what I'm interested in, again, the same thing happened with Jia Pingwa when people were angry at him because they wished too much. They gave too much responsibility to a literary writer because the writer only writes fiction. They focus on their work of art. The writer cannot work as a policeman. They cannot work as a government official to go to that village to rescue those women. They can't. From the literary point of view, Jia Pingwa actually did an excellent job. However, the vast majority of Chinese reader, they have nowhere to unleash their anger, unleash their, like this unjust thing, this unbearable, like inhuman happening in the reality. So that's why I understand the anger, like they criticize the writer so much from the Chinese reader perspective. What I'm interested in, how Jia Pingwa perceive such a social unjust thing happening. The interesting thing is, as many of Chinese works, the writers focus more from individual perspective. I couldn't say because I haven't read the book yet. What I'm interested, did the writer really dig up deeper So did he involve more like complex, complicated social, historical reasons and backgrounds into this thing, into this individual tragedy? You know, like why this thing's happening, why it's so many of cases still there. I noticed this book, the Chinese version was actually published in 2017, right? And it's been a few years. And then the Xuzhou case just reported last year or early this year. So, you know, like the whole thing's just put together. That's why this book right now, I guess more and more people discuss about this is because of that case, because of the case that brought this discussion into popular. So, I mean, I'm going to read the book, and thank you for the event. And I noticed that there's an audiobook version actually. You can buy like $15. I know, so I'm going to read that one. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much for the points. I think with time running quite tight, unless anyone has anything else that they would really desperately like to say, shall we pass it? I'm just going to pass the event to Angus, who will be leading the discussion on our event next month together with Olivia Milburn. So Angus, your show.
Oh, scary. Before I talk about that, I'm going to hit enter in the chat box because I put together a list of all the other Jia Pingwa in English translation that you can read besides this book.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
That's all right. And we got a Sinoist book in there. So I cunningly placed that at the top for you, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
Right. So now I'm going to give you a teaser to set the tone for the book we'll be looking at next month. Hopefully this comes through the microphones. Can anyone recognize this song?
I think everyone that's under a certain age range.
Yeah, it's Gangster's Paradise. So we're not doing a gangster novel, but we are doing a story that sort of turns into excess and vice. And we are in the countryside again, in the northern countryside. But the scope of the novel is much. Apologies for that interruption. I'll raise my voice as well. So the novel is also in the countryside, also in the north, but it is an older novel in the original Chinese publication. It's called Empires of Dust, and we're following a main character called Guo Cunqian. I'm going to cheat slightly. I'm going to read, maybe paraphrase a little blurb I've already written. So if my sentences become very verbose, that's because I'm reading. So it's an epic realist novel, and it charts the relentless rise and depraved fall of a restless entrepreneur, Mr. Guo Cunqian. He's a rugged individual who persists and profits through decades, I think, of history are covered in the book. We start off when he's a very young man, I think at the tail end of the Chinese Civil War. And then we go through various stages of 20th century Chinese history, basically. But the most important part that kind of defines the novel is the reform and opening period, I would say, because this is a guy who's not really content to go with the flow. He's always trying to, run a hustle, set up a scheme, and he becomes this local businessman. And he's so successful, he suffers from success, basically. He becomes a local tyrant and gets everything he wants in life. He gets it too good, he becomes corrupt. And so that's his rise and his fall, basically. It's a huge book. So we've done something to help you if you haven't got time to read a 700-page book in the month between now and the meeting. So I've popped a link which Sinoist Books have prepared for you, where you can read a chapter from the book. And it's taken from the part of the story where Cunqian is about to, he's about to come crashing down, but he's at like sort of the height of his depravity and misdeeds. So if you follow that link, that will bring you to a PDF of that chapter that you can read in advance. But you can also get the book from Sinoist Books in advance if you'd like to sort of get started on it. I know this one's published as an ebook and a print book. So if you want it quickly, it's right there for you. Last thing I'll say is it's an unusual book in English translation. it's pretty easy to get books by other writers of this author. I've not mentioned the author's name yet, have I? The author is called Jiang Zilong, and he's from a generation of writers who are quite widely published in translation. You might know names like Mo Yan, Yu Hua, Yan Yanke. It's not so hard to get one of their books in a bookshop in the UK or maybe the US. Jiang Zilong is something a little bit different because like all those other authors, he's writing about changes that washed over China sort of from the 80s onward, from reform and opening onwards after Mao Zedong. But his focus is on the reform and opening economic side of things. There's a whole sort of subgenre of literature that he's the big cheese of, called reform literature, and it's specifically about sort of the arrival of the free market, or the somewhat free market, in mainland China. So maybe doesn't sound as thrilling as a gangster novel, but it's if you're really interested in that specific area, or if you're interested to see how it can transform a village, ruin a village, transform a man, ruin a man, it's an interesting novel. And again, disclaimer, it's a biggie. So if you want to have a nice big book to get lost in, a realist epic, this is your book. And if you want to talk about it, you'll have a chance to do that next month. I hope I didn't go on too long there, Daniel.
I will conject two things. I would say the biggest success we had on marketing this title was that, imagine this is China's Grapes of Wrath, but set in reform China. I think that's the quickest way you can get up to speed of what this book is trying to do.
Certainly in the first half, yeah, maybe not so much the second half once the money's flowing. But exactly. Yeah, the first half, the village really goes through the motions of some of the roughest parts of Chinese history, famine and so on. And then that is an interesting context for the later corruption and overflow of wealth that hits the village. It's reading it was a trip. Like
and
that.
Then the second thing is that I'm not sure if everyone enjoys their kind of socialist realism here, but when this book was being reviewed, this was described as the capitalist answer to socialist realism. So I'm not sure if that's hooked anyone, but I would say if you read this book, you'll understand. If you ever had a Chinese banquet in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, where you get these kind of larger than life characters who's hogging all of the attention and yelling and smoking, swigging their baijiu and smoking their cigarettes. If you read this book, you'll understand where these people came from.
Yeah,
and it's that personally was a very interesting journey for me when I read it. So yeah.
You reminded me, yeah, politically the book is interesting because Jiang Zilong, writing at the time, he's one of the part of the League of Chinese Writers. It's a genre that's somewhat, I don't know if approved is the right word, but it was kosher in the state narrative at the time. But it works as a critique of capitalism and the free market. It works as an endorsement of the free market to an extent. It works as a critique of some of the excesses of, say, the Cultural Revolution. And, you know, if it's valorizing what an entrepreneur can do for the country, then you can read it as a critique of socialism as well. But you also have possibly the firm hand of the party coming in to set things right at the end. So politically, it's not really easy to reduce this book to something. It's good for conversations.
Would you say it represents maybe three things? Maybe three represents?
I'll have to phone up my wise elder to that one.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and we hope to see you next month. I popped a few links on this, all of that we're going to be talking about, including the Eventbrite in the chat box below. And then we'll also be shortly circulating an email to everyone that's attended, so you don't have to worry if you don't get it. We'll be circulating an email with the recording of this event and we really, really hope that we'll see you in June. So thank you all for joining us, and have a lovely weekend. and enjoy Jubilee next week, sorry. And we'll go from there, shall we? All right. Bye for now.